I think other than Edward Sullivan's name, the name you've heard the most during the past couple of days is Mary Carmen Ramírez. And so I think it is fitting that the last of the formal presentations before Edward's conversation with Mrs. Cisneros is going to be delivered by her. Mary Carmen Ramírez is the Wortham Curator of Latin American Art and Director of the International Center for the Arts of the Americas, ICAA, at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. Prior to that, she was Curator of Latin American Art at the Jack S. Blanton Museum of Art and Adjunct Lecturer in the Department of Art and Art History, both at the University of Texas in Austin. Sorry, not both, just there. Ramírez also served as Director of the Museo de Antropológica, Historia y Arte de la Universidad de Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras campus. She received her PhD in art history from the University of Chicago in 1989. Mary Carmen has curated numerous exhibitions, as you've been hearing, on Latin American art, whose venues range from her home base in Houston to Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, and Madrid. These include Antonio Berni, which you just heard about, constructed dialogues, concrete, geometric, and kinetic art from the Latin American Art Collection of the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, 2012. Joaquin Torres Garcia, constructing abstraction with wood, that was at the Menil Foundation. North Looks South, building the Latin American collection, the Latin American section of the Universalis at the 23rd Bienal de Sao Paulo, that was back in 1998. In tandem with Hector Olea, she curated Inverted Utopias, avant-garde art in Latin America at the MFA Houston in 2004, which was awarded which was given an award by the International Association of Art Critics as the best thematic museum show nationally. More recently, New York Times critic Holland Cotter declared Inverted Utopias one of the two most important exhibitions of the past decade. At the ICAA, Ramírez conceptualized and oversees the Continental Initiative Documents of 20th Century Latin American and Latino Art, a digital archive and publications project which is dedicated to the recovery and digitization of primary sources related to the artistic production of the region, and which offers access to more than 10,000 documents of Latin American and Latino art on its free website. So tune in. She is chief curator with Hector Olea for the Yale University Press series, Critical Documents of 20th Century Latin American and Latino Art, and co-editor with Oliver Debrois and others of the first volume of that series, Resisting Categories, Latin American and/or Latino. In 1997, Ramírez received the Peter Norton Family Foundation Award for Curatorial Excellence. And in 2005, she was the recipient of the Award for Curatorial Excellence granted by the Center for Curatorial Studies of Bard College. That same year, Time magazine named her one of the 25 most influential Hispanics in America. So we are fortunate indeed to have Mary Carmen here to round out our formal presentations. Please welcome her.
Thank you so much, Angie, for that generous presentation. I want to begin by thanking Angie Rice, Samantha Deutsch, and their staff for the invitation to be here today delivering this talk, as well as to my very dear colleague, Edward Sullivan, for organizing what has been an extremely stimulating, thought-provoking, and filled with lots of new information. What has been a really intensely productive symposium on collecting Latin American art in the United States. To begin, permanent collections are a museum's most prized assets. The collections not only justify a museum's existence, they define it for posterity. However, as is clear from many of the papers we have heard today, the project of assembling a comprehensive institutional collection of modern and contemporary Latin American art is one filled with unexpected challenges, ongoing pitfalls, intrinsic contradictions, and unpredictable blunders. In this respect, such an undertaking can be considered a tentative suspicious, if not skeptical endeavor. An initiative as doubtful as perhaps the flawed ideal of an imagined community encompassing the more than 20 countries and hundreds of ethnic groups that not only constitute the region, but also, quite frequently, individual countries within it, like Mexico. Hampered by complex histories of nationalism, uneven modernization, political repression, economic instability, and an unbelievable, though understandable, indifference towards other Latin American countries, very few institutions in Latin America have embarked on such a far-reaching effort to gather in one place outstanding examples of the art of this region. This includes, until very recently, even private collectors. In this regard, it may be time to recognize once and for all that the very idea of collecting modern and contemporary art from Latin America on a comprehensive or continental scale actually began in the United States in the 1930s and 40s at the Museum of Modern Art in New York under the auspices of Nelson Rockefeller and Alfred H. Barr Jr., a history that, as Delia Solomons reminded us today, had its ups and downs until the appointment of first Paulo Herkenhoff and then Luis Perez Oramas in the late 90s and early millennium to continue the history, the illustrious history of the initial collecting efforts of the Museum of Modern Art. As a result of these activities, Latin American art enjoyed early on a certain amount of visibility in New York circles, a momentum that gradually expanded with the city's rise as the preeminent global center of artistic and market legitimization, later reinforced by the establishment of specialized auctions in the late 70s and early 80s. Despite this influential yet spotty history, one could argue, however, that it was not in the East, but in the Lone Star state of Texas, where the idea to build overarching and all-encompassing collections of Latin American art found fertile ground since at least the second half of the 20th century. Coincidentally, as Estrellita Brodsky has reminded us, the trend can be traced to New York collectors Barbara and John Duncan, who were attracted early on to the University of Texas at Austin's Archer M. Huntington Art Gallery, now the Jack S. Blanton Museum of Art, in search of a proper place to house their drawings and paintings collection. Today, the Blanton's Museum's Latin American art holdings encompass over 1,800 modern and contemporary works in all media by more than 600 artists from Mexico, South and Central America, and the Caribbean. UT Austin is also home to the rather extensive Nicholas Murray collection of modern Mexican art that features among several hundred works some of the best-known Fridas, as well as the magnificent portrait of George Gershwin of 1936 by David Alfaro Siqueiros. The vast concentration of scholarly resources at UT Austin, in turn, not only justified the direction that the collection would take, but also served as a catalyst for the creation in 1988 of the first position of Curator of Latin American Art in the United States. In a similar vein, the San Antonio Museum of Art, SAMA, is home to an extensive collection of Mexican and Latin American paintings, sculptures, works on paper, and decorative arts extending to the 1920s. Ironically, these holdings include the prestigious collection of Mexican folk art assembled by another New Yorker, Nelson A. Rockefeller. And last but not least, the most recent addition to this distinguished list is the Latin American art collection at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, which is the main focus of this presentation. The ubiquity of Latin American art in Texas should not come as a surprise, considering this state's idiosyncratic history and long-standing historical, political, cultural, and economic links with the country south of the Rio Grande. Indeed, the fact that until 1836, the state of Coahuila, Texas, was officially part of Mexico, and that today they share a 1,248-mile border, attests to a sui generis cultural and political environment that is alien to the East, And California is actually the only other state that not only shares that history, but also the potential that comes with it. To this undeniable history must be added the enduring presence since the colonial period of Mexican nationals, Mexican Americans or Chicanos, as well as the continuous influx of immigrants, initially from Mexico, but in the last few decades also from Central and South America and the Caribbean, who have made Texas their home. Nowadays, with more than 40% of the population claiming either Latin American or Latino descent, Texas, like most of the border states, and increasingly the country, is living proof of the reversible process of Latinoization of the United States, a process that, as demonstrated by the 2012 presidential election, has the potential to influence the long-term future of this nation. In this context, the added value of Latin American art in Texan museums has less to do directly with artistic fads or market trends. Instead, these initiatives are grounded in the urgent need for these institutions to reinvent themselves in light of the cultural demands of their increasingly diverse audiences. Only in this way can Texan institutions ensure their long-term relevance, if not mere survival. With a population of 6 million, 40% of which is Latino, Houston has not been immune to the radical demographic trends that are significantly altering the state. Indeed, 56 to 60% of Houston's school-age population today is Latino. This fact, together with a long tradition of cultural philanthropy grounded in the city's preeminent share of the oil, gas, commercial shipping, and health industries, provided the stimuli for an unprecedented program at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston that started with the millennium. One aimed at collecting, exhibiting, researching, and promoting modern and contemporary Latin American and Latino art. The establishment in 2001 of an endowed curatorial department, together with a research center, the International Center for the Arts of the Americas, or ICAA, underscored both the financial as well as the ethical commitment in perpetuity of the museum with this emergent field of scholarship and curatorial expertise. In addition to the intense focus on research embodied by the ICAA and its landmark digital archive initiative, Documents of 20th Century Latin American and Latino Art, the most salient aspect of the MFAH's multifaceted program was the mandate to assemble a brand new collection of modern and contemporary art from Mexico, Central and South America, and the Caribbean, as well as outstanding examples of US Latino art. Having started near zero, the collection today encompasses over 200 artists and 600 works of 20th and 21st century art in all media. And I have to clarify that while this is the brand new collection that we started in 2001, at the time the museum already had holdings, very spotty holdings in the areas of painting and sculpture, but it was particularly in the area of photography where the maverick curator, Ann Wilkes Tucker, had already embarked in building a collection of Latin American modern and contemporary photography during the 1980s and 1990s. So the museum owns over 600 photographs representative of the art of the region. Our prints and drawings department had also been actively collecting, particularly Mexican graphics, so that the entire holdings of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston in terms of Latin American art are really around 1,300. The organization of such a collection illustrates both the challenges as well as the rewards at the core of what 13 years ago, particularly from the perspective of mainstream US art museums, was still a rather risky enterprise. Thus, I would like to focus the rest of this talk on a discussion of some of the theoretical and practical issues posed by such an undertaking. 2001, the idea of organizing a permanent collection of 20th and 21st century Latin American and Latino art in a major encyclopedic museum represented at best an unedited opportunity. At worst, a very challenging, if not daunting, enterprise. With the exception of the iconic masters of the first half of the century, Rivera, Orozco, Siqueiros, Orozco, Kahlo, Lam, Tamayo, and Mata, who were the only two represented in the museum's collection, the majority of the artists from Latin America who contributed to international modernism were not only unknown in the United States, but their work had relatively little market presence or even value. Within the complexity and heterogeneity embodied by the operative construct of Latin American art, there thus loomed a series of challenging questions. How to begin to articulate, out of practically nowhere, a collection that in some always incomplete, if not fragmentary way, would represent the richness of the art produced in the region. And within this objective, how to evade the stereotypes and commonplaces with which Latin American art had been pigeonholed until then. How to insert this art into a larger museum collection that operated within the canonical parameters of an encyclopedic museum. And anticipating our next step, what kind of model could serve as blueprint for this collection building effort? Further compounding this scenario is the project for a third museum building with a specific focus on post-1900 art, where the production of Latin American and Latino artists will be generously displayed for the first time on a permanent dialogue and on equal footing with their renowned European and North American counterparts. And I'm showing here a view of the two buildings, existing buildings of the museum, one by Mies van der Rohe, the other one by Rafael Moneo, and the empty parking lot where the third building is going to be located. And this is a very preliminary rendering of what that building would look like by Stephen Hall. And I should clarify from the start that the idea is not to do separate galleries of Latin American art, but to integrate them within the broader narrative of 20th and 21st century art. At the core of this situation, there lay the particular dilemma confronted by institutional collections. Unlike the malleability that characterized private collections, museum holdings, even in the most dynamic institutions, are slowly amassed over time in response to market opportunities, critical consensus, generous patrons, and acquisitions endowments. As a result, the process of building an art museum collection is a very slow one that not always produces a coherent ensemble, at least in the short term. Furthermore, in a period of economic crisis, dwindling resources, combined with skyrocketing prices and the intrinsic difficulties that this process entails, have frequently led museums to dedicate more funds and time to temporary exhibitions than to permanent collections. In this context, the temporary exhibition has become a dynamic tool to test new approaches and museological models. This situation led us to raise the following questions. What if the development of the collection were to be approached as a comprehensive temporary exhibition? What would happen if, much like we do in temporary displays, objects from different media, time periods, and cultural or geographic regions were placed in dialogue with one another in permanent collection displays? In this context, the parallel work that the museum undertook between 2001 and 2004 by means of Inverted Utopias, avant-garde art in Latin America, co-curated by Hector Olea and myself, suggested a creative way out to approach the task of building the museum's permanent collection. This comprehensive exhibition showcased approximately 350 works by 63 avant-garde pioneers in the continent, many of whom, despite the visibility they enjoyed in Latin America and frequently in Europe, had never or very rarely been shown in the United States. Additionally, Inverted Utopias not only brought the work of these creators to the attention of US audiences, but also dared to introduce a new exhibition model based on the notion of constellations, dialectically theorized by Hector Olea on the basis of Theodor Adorno's aesthetic theory. The show was indeed organized on the basis of 6 constellations that included such antinomies as universal and vernacular, play and grief. I'm showing you views, general views of the galleries with the different constellations. Progression and rupture, vibrational and stationary, touch and gaze, and cryptic and committed. Well beyond art historical parameters, such a theoretical model condenses, rather than illustrates, destabilizing themes, innovative approaches, or even regional sensibilities with regard to modernism and its commonplaces. It does suggest that the idea of inversion of the worn-out utopias of modernism was more a political stance than an aesthetic naivete or an exercise of style. The constellation model allowed us to assemble works by means of luminous points, that is, key developments or singular visions that expose the nexus and oppositions between these artists, their works, and the specific context of art production. From political to religious, from adaptations to innovations, from the questioning of central paradigms to unique contributions, not only to the region, but to 20th century art as a whole. The malleability of this relational relative model provokes simultaneous readings of the selected works, namely from comparative perspectives capable of grasping in one single glance historical, cultural, and/or formal traits with no artistic biases or hierarchies involved. Such luminous points are capable of stimulating material or physical knowledge as compelling as written art historical accounts, thus serving to orient broader and much less centralized readings of art historical insights. From this point of view, both the theoretical parameters handled as well as the conceptual flexibility at the heart of inverted utopias suggested a viable blueprint for the long-term development of the museum's core Latin American art collection. One that in its flexibility and far-ranging scope bypassed most hindrances confronted by traditional methods of building institutional holdings. The fact that many of the artists represented in inverted utopias had until then operated on the margins of the mainstream art world would ensure that outstanding examples of their production were still available. In hindsight, there is no doubt that taking risks with artistic manifestations that were still lacking mainstream validation proved to be an efficient strategy. Proceeding from inverted utopias, the kernel of the collection building effort would concentrate on pioneers and key exponents of the avant-garde in Latin America. This included independent visionaries and innovators like Jules Solar, David Alfaro Siqueiros, or Joaquín Torres Garcia, all of whom, both in theory as well as in practice, set out to push the limits of art. The idea was to collect, when feasible, the production of these artists in depth, and to select works that would allow us to generate either dialogues or tensions in the permanent exhibition space. The fact that at that time, the market was being flooded with post-war constructive and geometric artworks, tendencies that had lingered on the margins for decades in search of institutional attention, proved auspicious to this undertaking. Indeed, the first 2 works that entered the new collection clearly pointed out the direction that the museum's collecting effort would take. Joaquín Torres Garcia's Structure in Primary Colors of 1929, a key example of the master's paradigmatic wood constructions, or maderas, as well as his decisive dialogues with Piet Mondrian and Theo van Desburg. And Gego's Reticularia of 1975, the last of the series of autonomous stainless steel constructions produced by the artist as offshoots of her Gran Reticularia environment done in Caracas in 1969. Both of these works embodied the singularity and diversity of approaches to constructivism that took hold in Latin American countries since the early 1930s. Each piece does function to articulate constellatory groupings. Torres Garcia's Structure in Primary Colors served to anchor a series of works by the Argentinian Madí group that included the cutout frame pieces by Rod Rothfuss and articulated structures by Yula Kosice and Carmelo Ardenquin, even though Carmelo Ardenquin's is not being shown here. The relationship between the Torres Garcia's Structure in Primary Colors and the Madí works is not just an interpretation on my part, but it's really grounded in historical facts. Torres Garcia was not only a bridge between European modernism and South American and the South American avant-garde, but it was precisely the type of maderas and articulated toys or maderas represented by the Structure in Primary Colors that provided the stimulus for these kinds of works produced by Madí a few years later. The same work also set the pace for the accession of a number of maderas by Torres Garcia and his disciples, who integrated the so-called School of the South. These are Julio Alpuy, Gonzalo Fonseca, and Francisco Mato. At the other extreme, Gallegos served as catalyst for a series of works by Jesus Rafael Soto, Carlos Cruz Diez, and Alejandro Otero, as well as a representative collection of her own work, which includes the largest collection of works on paper at any museum or private collection. A third group of acquisitions, grounded in inverted utopias, a third group of acquisitions grounded in the inverted utopias chart of possibilities included constructive artists who worked with light and water as their primary medium, many of whom were featured through optic and haptic readings in the Touch and Gaze constellation. Early on, the museum was able to acquire seminal works included in the exhibition by pioneers Julio Leparc and Yula Kosice. These works constituted the basis for a group of light-based structures by, among others, Abraham Palachinic, Marta Boto, and Gregorio Vardanega. At the same time, this type of production was anchored by two paradigmatic installations, Carlos Cruz Diez's Chromosaturation of 1965 and Yula Kosice's The Hydrospatial City of 1958, a work that stands out not only for its effective use of light, but more importantly, for its innovative use of plexiglass to construct poetic habitats. In 2007, the accession of the Adolfo Lerner collection of Brazilian constructive art represented another landmark for the museum. It allowed us to cover in one fell swoop over 100 pieces representative of the development of these tendencies in Brazil between 1950 and 1962. This included paradigmatic examples of concretismo and neoconcretismo, many of which were represented in inverted utopias, as you were able to see in the earlier slides. It also included, well, these are examples of concretismo and neoconcretismo, artists like Weisman, Sassilotto, Mauricio Nogueira Lima, Elio Tisica, Vilis de Castro. But it also included not only the canonic artists of Brazilian constructivism, but also a wide range of abstract pioneers, including the members of the Atelier Abstraction, such as Samson Flexer, or a group of independent artists such as Milton da Costa, Sergio Camargo, Volpi. There are about 6 Volpis in the collection, as well as very idiosyncratic early works by Mira Schendel, artists like Mira Schendel, who operated on the margins of these groups. The Lerner collection not only expanded the breadth of the museum's collecting efforts in this area, but consolidated constructivism as a major area of strength in the burgeoning collection, thus allowing us to establish productive dialogues with other constructive artists represented in the museum's Latin American holdings. Curiously, this was all happening at a time when the mainstream paradigm of Latin American art started to shift from figuration and the fantastic to the consolidation of what can be considered a new canon embodied by concrete and neo-concrete art. These are views of the exhibition Constructed Dialogues, where we deliberately set out to establish dialogues not only between the learner collection artists, but also other artists represented in the collection. The concentration of constructive and geometric art tendencies in the museum's Latin American art collection strongly established a path that, if pursued in ever greater depth, could have determined an exclusive niche for the institution. Yet, given the broad scope of its programming as well as the nature of its audience, the possibility of crafting such a narrow focus for the Latin American collection was not an option in an encyclopedic museum such as the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. The acquisition at that time of large-scale assemblages and prints by the Argentinian Antonio Berni, together with the illustrated furniture of Colombian Beatriz González and the iconoclastic production of the Argentinian Luis Felipe Noé, served to ground another constellatory ensemble represented by the 1960s and 70s figure-based avant-garde. These include an important selection of works by the Argentinian Otra Figuración artists Luis Felipe Noé, Jorge de la Vega, and Rómulo Machió, as well as their contemporaries, Alberto Heredia and Juan Carlos Di Stefano, whose work, Telaraña, is here seen in dialogue with another major recent acquisition, a major drawing by Roberto Mata. Further broadening the selection of works from these critical decades, and all of these works came from the Jorge Amarion Health Collection in Buenos Aires. Further broadening the selection of works from these critical decades is the work of Latino artists like the Puerto Rican Domingo Garcia and the Mexican-born, Chicago-based Marcos Raya, who combined key aspects of the pop sensibility with elements from their vernacular cultures to produce creolized versions of this international trend. As evident by the examples discussed so far, the constellatory model provided by Inverted Utopias charted an initial ground plan for building the core collection of Latin American art at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. From the beginning, however, the idea was not to restrict the collection building effort to this paradigmatic survey, but to take it as a point of departure and go beyond its chronological and geographic scope. As with any temporary exhibition, the fact that many artists were not represented in Inverted Utopias was an intrinsic limitation that can only be overcome with a focused, long-term collection building effort. In the meantime, however, the collection has continued to expand significantly into the contemporary area, thanks to major acquisitions by well-established or mid-career artists who stand out for their contributions to the medium of installation, video, or process-based art. These include such emblematic large-scale installations as Alfredo Jar's The Eyes of Gutete Merita of 1996, Teresa Margolles' Lote Bravo of 2005, the first work by this artist to enter a US museum collection. Daniel Joseph Martinez, Happiness is Overrated of 1996, a work that represents one of the first experiments with animatronics undertaken by a Latino or Latin American artist. Oscar Muñoz's Narcisa and Pixels of 2003. Sildo Meireles' Volachil of 1980 to 1994. And this is one example of a series of gifts that the museum has also received from Diane and Bruce Halley in Phoenix, who have been extremely generous to our institution, both in the curatorial acquisitions area as well as with the ICAA. Another major installation, Tunga's Les Arts of 1989. Carmela Gross, A Negra, and one of the most recent additions to the collection, Guillermo Cuica's emblematic 53 mattress ensemble titled Les Sacres of 1992. The museum has also continued to acquire artists in the mid-career artists, such as the younger generation, exemplified by the Argentinian Grupo Mondongo's appropriation of the history of art in ironic skulls made of sculpted clay. To the extent that these works employ conceptual, sensory-based, or interactive strategies that playfully elicit the viewer's active participation to address pressing social issues, they carry the potential to articulate new constellations that cut across national, chronological, and geographic borders. This will be the topic of an upcoming exhibition titled Contingent Beauty, an exhibition that was slated for the end of next year. Moreover, and in partnership with Fundación Gego, in 2010, the creation of a special restricted fund, the Venezuela, Colombia, Central America, and the Caribbean Art Fund, has allowed the museum to aggressively collect major examples of the work of contemporary artists from these underrepresented countries. These include Miguel Angel Rojas, exemplified here with his magnificent piece, Broadway, but also including a very, it's an artist that we have collected in depth with examples of his videos and other earlier works. José Alejandro Restrepo, El Paso del Quindío. Javier Telles with Joan of Arc, another gift of Bruce and Diane Halley. Tania Bruguera, Joana Calle, Magdalena Fernández, and Maria Fernanda Cardoso, among many others. The core of the Caribbean Art Fund, as we call it, is really artists from, that were born after 1960, but this has not prevented us from collecting a series of artists that were historically significant and are representative of an earlier generation, such as Carlos Rojas, Eugenio Espinosa, Claudio Perna, and many others. It must be underscored that the museum's partnership with Fundación Gego is only one example of a series of innovative, long-term alliances that our institution has established over the last decade with artist estates, private or institutional collections, such as Malba Fundación Constantini in Buenos Aires, the Fundación Cruz Diez in Houston, and the Capriles Brillenburg collection of Latin American art. These multifaceted, enriching partnerships involve, sorry, I'm running ahead of my time. These multifaceted, enriching partnerships involve collection sharing, exhibitions, research, publications, and conservation efforts. Being conscious of the enormous span of the region involved and the variety of production to be encompassed, the rationale behind this type of initiative is that the museum does not need to own works of art in order to show them or generate programs around them. And I want to end with some views, as I saw furtively, of the last work that we inaugurated last week, a work that was 10 years in the making, and is Jesus Rafael Soto's Houston Penetrable, the last work commissioned specifically by the museum for Colonial Hall, which is in the Mies van der Rohe building. It was Soto's very last work. He died about 3 or 4 weeks after he completed the designs for this magnificent piece, which is a penetrable, a very unusual one, because instead of being monochromatic like most of the penetrables, it has this magnificent yellow ellipsis in the middle, which is what made it so difficult to produce. The work has 24,000 strands. It is by far the biggest penetrable that Soto ever did. It's 3 feet high and covers almost 3,000 square feet. At the core of discussions about permanent collections, there lies the issue of how museums use space to tell stories for audiences by recharting both the ancient and the immediate artistic past. As Homi Bhabha has recently argued, the museum can only reconfigure the experience of the past through its awareness regarding the present. And it does so by translating the relational value of its objects and practices in the exhibition area. That is, by recognizing that the value of these objects is not an absolute. On the contrary, it hinges on their relevance to our present time. Undoubtedly, the task of building a permanent collection of Latin American and Latino art at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston has involved this type of mediation. As I have tried to show in this presentation, the constellation model provided by Inverted Utopias not only provided a blueprint for the collection, but has also contributed to the legitimization of artists whose work remained marginalized for decades. An article in the New York Times recently underscored a key point at stake in this regard, and I quote, "Few museums would have dedicated its resources to an artist such as Soto, who, though acclaimed in Latin America and Europe, has little name recognition here in this country," end of quote. The idea of bringing to the table new values, new names, new artists grounded in long-term research and arduous implementation exemplifies the commitment towards innovation and expansion of the field of Latin American art at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. The success or failure of this model will be tested in the new building being designed by architect Stephen Hall and slated for completion in 2018. In the meantime, the collection remains a dynamic work in progress and a living testament to the vitality of avant-garde and contemporary artistic manifestations in Latin America. Thank you.